All right, let's just dive right in. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're embarking on a really fascinating exploration of the hidden structures that essentially govern our existence. We're talking about the codes we live by. And no, I'm not just talking about computer code. We're going to be looking at the underlying rules, the frameworks, and that hidden logic that dictates exactly how our world works, scaling all the way up from the microscopic level to massive global systems. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with Section 1, our hidden biological codes. Then 2, structuring alternative financial codes. 3, rethinking our moral codes. 4, the history of speciesism. 5, the factory farming reality. And finally 6, expanding the moral circle.
So, just to make sure we're all entirely on the same page, let's quickly define our central theme. When we say code today, what we mean is a system of rules, signals, or structural frameworks that organize information, govern behavior, and literally shape our reality. Keep that lens in mind as we go through our source material today, because these codes really do dictate everything from our cells to our societies. Okay, Section 1, our hidden biological codes, the microscopic rules. Let's start with our first and really our most fundamental framework, which is the genetic code written into our very biology. Take the number 5, for instance. According to the Medline Plus genetics database, this is the exact chromosomal location of the AF4 gene. It resides precisely on chromosome 5. And that's a perfect example of a hardwired biological code, right? It's a tiny, highly specific set of instructions that just exists as a matter of pure biological fact. It forms the very building blocks of human life. Moving on to Section 2, structuring alternative financial codes, systems of society. Let's zoom out from microscopic genetics to explore how institutions actually design complex financial codes to align with specific cultural and religious beliefs. A prime example of this, evaluated in recent financial research, is the Bank of England's Alternative Liquidity Facility, or the ALF. See, when a massive traditional institution like the Bank of England needs to interact with entirely different societal rules, it literally has to write a new code. Well, how does the ALF actually function? It utilizes what's called a sukuk-based investment structure. Now, unlike traditional bonds that just pay interest, a sukuk represents ownership in an actual portfolio of assets. And why does that matter? Because this highly specific structural framework allows the facility to operate securely within the ethical and legal codes of Islamic finance, which ensures strict Sharia compliance. It is quite literally a financial code built from the ground up to respect a religious code. Which brings us to Section 3. Rethinking our moral codes, the ethics of existence. Now we're going to scale up once again to the global and philosophical level. How do we design the ethical rules of how we live? We're going to spend a good chunk of our time here today because unlike biological facts or financial systems, moral codes are arguably the most complex, debatable, and just the hardest frameworks to program into any society. To explore this, we're drawing from a really compelling recent lecture delivered in the Philippines by the renowned philosopher Peter Singer. Singer actually roots his argument in a pivotal 18th century quote from Jeremy Bentham. Historically, humans defined our moral codes based on things like intelligence or language, but Bentham forced this massive paradigm shift. He asked, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Singer uses this to argue that the true baseline for moral consideration shouldn't be about whether a being can solve a math problem or hold a conversation. It should simply be about whether they have the capacity to feel pain. And this leads us directly to Singer's foundational ethical stance, which is the principle of equal consideration of similar interests. The core argument here is that we ought to give equal moral weight to similar interests, like, say, the very basic desire to avoid physical pain, irrespective of the species in question. According to this framework, if a being can suffer, that suffering absolutely must be factored into our moral code impartially, without some built-in bias that favors only human interests. Section 4, the history of speciesism, tracing Western thought. So, if equal consideration is the proposed ethical standard, how did we get to where we are today? Let's take a quick look at how Western philosophical codes historically justified human dominion over animals. Historically, this really builds chronologically. Back in ancient Greece, Aristotle argued that animals existed purely for human purposes, which, to be fair, was a view formed totally without any knowledge of evolution. By the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas took that idea and blended it with theological texts to reinforce absolute human dominion. Fast forward to the 18th century, and Immanuel Kant continued this thread, denying we had direct duties to animals because they aren't self-conscious. It wasn't really until Bentham came along that the paradigm on suffering began to shift, eventually paving the way for Singer's incredibly influential book, Animal Liberation, in 1975.
Singer uses this history to outline a concept he calls speciesism. He draws these direct structural parallels between historical human exploitation and our treatment of non-human animals. Think about intrahuman dominance, things like historical racism or sexism. These were often driven by one group exploiting another through technological or physical power imbalances. Singer argues that human dominance over animals follows this exact same underlying code. We use our advanced human technology to exploit less powerful species entirely for our own interest, completely overriding their basic interests in the process.
Section 5, the factory farming reality, the industrialization of animals. So, how do these historical moral codes actually manifest in the modern world? Well, they culminate in the industrialization of animals, specifically within the global food industry. The crucial point here is this absolutely staggering number. A lot of times when we think of animal ethics, we picture scientific research, right? And the lecture notes that roughly 200 million animals are used in research globally each year. But that completely pales in comparison to food production. Are you ready for this? A mind-blowing 200 billion vertebrate animals are raised and killed for food globally every single year. I mean, the sheer scale of this systemic code is almost unimaginable.
And you know what complicates this massive industrialization? Modern science. Our understanding of animal intelligence has just grown immensely over the last 50 years. The lecturer shares this amazing anecdote about Australian cockatoos. These wild birds actually learned by observing each other how to outsmart humans and pry open these specific red-lidded urban trash cans just to get food scraps. It's a learned, socially transmitted problem-solving behavior. And it really highlights the incredible awareness and cognitive abilities of the creatures we share the planet with, which even includes fish and octopuses, which science now strongly suggests absolutely feel pain. Now, the lecture does acknowledge that since 1975, there has definitely been some legislative progress. Back then, it was totally standard for veal calves to be confined in these tiny 18-inch stalls, unable to even turn around, separated from their mothers within hours of birth. Today, thankfully, those individual stalls are actually illegal across the European Union and the United Kingdom.
But massive systemic issues still totally remain in the code of global factory farming. The lecture outlines some truly profound arguments against this industrial code. For one, chickens are now bred to grow so unnaturally fast that their bone structures literally can't support their own weight, which causes them constant pain. But this goes way beyond just animal welfare. Factory farming actually drastically reduces the net food available to humans because we have to feed immense amounts of grain to the animals first. It massively increases greenhouse gas emissions, driving climate change. And critically, crowding thousands of stressed animals into these packed sheds creates the perfect breeding ground for viruses, which drastically heightens our risk of zoonotic pandemics, like the swine flu.
Section 6, expanding the moral circle, contextual ethics. Applying these moral codes globally, however, is incredibly complex. And this is where the explainer gets really nuanced, bringing in some fascinating commentary from Professor Yassel Naval on the unique challenges faced in the global south, particularly looking at the Philippines.
Professor Naval points out a real tension between global ethical standards and local food security. Because on one side, you have strict Western veganism, which can sometimes rely really heavily on resource-intensive, industrially produced, imported plant-based substitutes. We're talking huge monocultures of soy or almond milk. But on the other side, you have indigenous, integrated farming practices in rural communities. These are very low-input, circular systems where families might plant root crops like cassava and raise just a few chickens or pigs that forage naturally. It creates a sustainable loop that ensures their immediate, day-to-day survival.
This leads to a really powerful point from Professor Naval. She argues that prescribing veganism in the global south, including the Philippines, may actually carry the risk of becoming morally insensitive. She points out that famine and hunger are very often issues of distribution and structural poverty, not necessarily absolute food shortages. Forcing a strict, one-size-fits-all dietary code without addressing the underlying structural poverty that limits people's choices, well, that risks sidelining resilient local ecological practices that people depend on. So, to bridge this gap, the lecturer proposes the concept of flexible veganism. It's a contextual food ethic. The idea is that it acknowledges that if you have the luxury of walking into a massive supermarket with endless choices, you should absolutely strive to avoid funding the cruelties of factory farming. But it also honors the necessity of local survival and human dignity for vulnerable populations. It's about finding a balance, avoiding the systemic cruelty of industrial farming while still actively supporting ecological resilience and indigenous practices.
And that brings us to the end of our journey today. We have looked at hard biological realities, intricate financial architectures, and the deep, challenging history of our ethical frameworks regarding animals and our environment. So, the final question I want to leave you with to reflect on is simply this: are we willing to expand the circle of our moral concern? Take some time to think about the codes you live by today and ask yourself what it would look like to rewrite them for a more compassionate world. Thanks so much for learning with me today, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.